I've never had to enforce that. So I've never had to enforce that policy. So luckily that's good. But what I feel like is when we say that English is crazy or doesn't make any sense, we are taking the power away from our students to understand it. And we're saying, you know, if it's crazy, there's no way you're going to be able to do anything with it anyway. So why bother, you know, learning it? So to me, it's kind of like when I raise my daughters who are now 23 years old, I don't tell them, you know, gosh, you could get, you know, hit by a car or get stuck in a tornado or all these things that could possibly happen. I basically tell them 80% of life is easy peasy. 20%, that's why you need insurance. That's why you get an education and you have fallback plans and things like that. But if we told our kids every single possible thing that could go wrong, like you could fall off a chair and die or get bit by a spider or all that, they would never leave your basement. So to me, if we say English makes sense and maybe what you don't know yet is what you're looking at, but you'll discover it soon enough, then I think that helps kids to realize and pay attention to the language and see how much of it makes sense. Okay. So this is just my slide about me. I've been teaching, I started in the public schools. I've been teaching struggling readers for 30 years. I started a learning center, and then Kendra Learning is my training program. We're accredited by MSLEC and IDA. And then we also sell materials and all those kinds of things. So that's what I do. Our sight words and oftentimes reading them because they're irregular. So when we talk about sight words, a lot of times what happens is we give kids those Fry word lists and we teach them that, you know, they have to memorize list by list. But these started, you know, 1928, 1957, and they thought we should just memorize them based on frequency instead of maybe being a little bit more thoughtful about how we are teaching them. So some people call them sight words, some people call them high frequency words, some call them automatic words. But the reality is they're all highly frequent. So, and they make up 60% of text. So you have to know them. And they need to be recognized instantly from memory. So whether they're phonetically regular or irregular, and right now, you know, there's, you know, a lot of talk around these words, and the words keep changing, and people will say, don't call them irregular, call them unexpected, you know, don't call them non-phonetic. There's a reason for them. So to me, you know, I think as long as we all agree really on what the definition of those are, then it's going to make it a lot easier for us. So I've interchangeably used all those terminologies so that we can kind of discuss them. But high frequency words are those most frequent words, you know, so if you don't know the first 300 most frequent words, you're not going to be able to get through even, you know, basically a decodable reader because they're all over the place. Our majority of our high frequency words are function words, and those are those grammatical words, and they tend to be abstract, the ones that it's hard to find a definition for, like was and is and should and could. Those are all, you know, grammatical words that are, you know, that kids can use orally, but they may not know how to read or spell, right? This is my kind of model about how I kind of go through my words and sort them and choose them to be more efficient. Because if you have kids that struggle, you don't have a ton of time to go back over every single word individually. But if you can cluster them into smaller groups, then it makes it a lot easier and a lot more efficient for you. So when I look at function words, I look at phonetic and non-phonetic because a lot of them are really easy to sound out and you don't need to spend much time on them at all. You can just kind of sort them by phonetic pattern and discuss the meaning and you're done. Now the non-phonetic ones, those are the ones that cause the problems, but that's why I put not taught, because non-phonetic just means there's not, you know, a rule governing them that you know. It doesn't mean that there isn't one. It just means that at this point of instruction, you don't know why that is saying that sound or why it's doing what it's doing in its spelling, right? Lexical words are content words, and they kind of go into two big areas of concrete and abstract. kids tend to have an easier time with concrete, and abstract words tend to be a little bit harder. But they, you know, when they're learning meaning, but if they're highly frequent, the meaning tends to be known already. So it's probably more important to spend more time on, you know, part of speech or multiple meanings, or if you can pull a phonetic pattern together, than meaning, because highly frequent words, most kids come in kindergarten being able to use these first words. Like they know how to say, you know, can I, should I, will you, all of those words that are highly frequent, they can use them and they use them correctly. They may not be able to specifically just, you know, define them, but they can use them. Okay. So when I sort my words, this is just written out exactly what I was telling you, that I go for my phonetic and non-phonetic, right? Those irregular, unexpected, non-phonetic words. And it's wholly, remember, dependent on what has been taught. So, but the thing about this is that when you're working with kids who struggle, you can see quite easily in their writing samples the high frequency words that they are struggling with. You'll probably see the same, you know, misspelling over and over and over again of the word does, right? Then you know that that's a word that you need to work on, and it's going to help you fine tune what words you pick to work on, right? You know, concrete versus abstract, like the word feet, it's totally phonetic, easy to read, you know, understand. The word that is abstract, but it is still completely phonetic. So whether if they can read it, but they know the word that, then it's not really going to be a problem. So get those out of the way, and then you can focus on all the phonetic ones. And I call I hope this isn't the trend, but I'm going to go in and out the entire time. Okay, so lexical words are often easier to spell, but I don't know if you guys heard me before I got kicked out, but I was wondering if you want to put in the chat like what grade you teach, or if there's any particular you know, words that you are concerned with or questions that you have about your students. I mean, please feel free to fill that in. Right. Lexical words carry the meaning in a phrase or a sentence. So they tend to be your nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. So these are really your meaning words. And your function words are pretty hard to define usually. Like, you know, is, if you said, or of, if you asked a kid to tell you what of means, they'd probably say, well, it was made of wood. Like they know how to use it, but they don't know how to define it. Most of our high frequency words are our function words. They're grammatical words that hold the sentence together, like auxiliary verbs, prepositions, conjunctions, pronouns, and articles. And most of these words come from Anglo-Saxon, so Old English. And so they have quite a few irregular spellings, but definitely patterns can be found. And I'm going to talk to you about a bunch of those. And many function words have two possible pronunciations. They are the weak version and the strong version. And so this is something that we really need to know if you work with young kids, because if you work with young kids and you say, run to the store, if they're decoding it and they're saying each word, they would probably go run to the store, right? Or they might even say run to the store. And it's very clear because they're still in that, word by word decoding phase. Well, once you have, been reading for a while, you tend to read with prosody, which is more like the way that you speak. So if I said, run to the store, then run to the store, you hear run clearly and you hear store clearly because those are the meaning words. Those are the lexical words, they're carrying the meaning. So even if you didn't hear to the in the middle, you'd probably be like, oh, I need to go to the store, right? But these words are stressed and they carry the accent in the sentence. So, we always stress the meaning words in our sentences. So when kids are first learning to read, they're saying each individual one, but the reality is to the does not sound like to the in a sentence when we say it. Since they're unstressed, they have that schwa sound, that sound, and they'll change pronunciation in connected text. So that to the sounds a lot like to the, right? So if I say it quickly, I go run to the store, run to the, right? So depending on how slowly I say it, that's how much how enunciated it is, then you're going to hear that totally phonetic representation. So a lot of time,
We're frozen again.
so weird. Sorry about this. Yes, so Cami said this is especially difficult for English language learners, and it is. But what makes it easier is if the teacher understands what's really happening, right? So a lot of times when the kids are having trouble with these words, we don't even realize that this is what's happening. We're like, well, I said to the store, and the kids are like, I don't know what you're talking about. So run to the store. If kids, that's where a lot of times with phonological awareness, they hear it one way, but it is definitely pronounced another way. So we need to make sure we're aware of it so we can explain it to kids so that when they think they're not hearing it correctly, we can say, no, you really are. That's what it sounds like, but that's not correct.
Jennifer, we lost sound.
Yeah, I'm talking, my computer guy just walked in, so I muted it because I was complaining as to why this is happening. I was seeing if he knew. He's like, I don't know. So we'll just continue on. All right. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to start it right now. Okay. I'll see what happens if it happens again. No, that's okay. Thanks. Computer guys. He just goes, we're the worst. Okay. So here, but if we are saying, okay, we've got this word ear, and we need to try to get kids to recognize the difference between H-E-R-E and H-E-A-R, instead of trying to put those two next to one another, we can say, okay, here's ear, this is your ear, and you know what your ear is, and this is how you spell it. And talk about the meaning, because the very first thing that I do is discuss the meaning, so, and I'll ask, what is an ear? And kids have to tell me, what is an ear? What do you use an ear for? You use your ear to hear, right? And we talk about the words that go and the definition of it. We use it in a sentence. You always want to be able to use these words in sentences, because if kids don't know how to use the words and they don't know the meaning, then there's really no point in learning them, right? So we learn words because we either know them already and we're learning to spell them, or the meaning behind them, but we've heard them, or we're learning them for the first time, and we're going to need to know the meaning, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense to learn how to read or spell a word that you don't know how to use or know what the meaning is. You'll also have to discuss that there's vowel shifts in a lot of Old English words, which are a lot of the words that are most confusing in our language. Latin and Greek are like easy peasy. We're going to talk about those a little bit today, but they're very predictable. But Old English, we have to chunk things into easier groups to help kids to understand the meaning and the spelling. But there's oftentimes, interesting reasons and interesting stories for kids to listen to and get them to anchor to these. So ear, and then here is ear, and then heard is ear. Now, this one, co-articulation is a common thing in our language, which is our mouth is moving. We don't say sounds in isolation. We run our sounds together, because I don't say I saw a cat, right? I say I saw a cat. And when I do that, I am putting, co-articulating. My voice is going from one note or sound in our language to the next. And so when that happens, you're passing by other sounds in your mouth. And so sometimes some sounds can sound different than you think they're going to or supposed to. So that happens a lot with like TR, like tree, because when you go from a t to a ch, or to the r, you pass ch. That's why you hear tree, and it's why you hear dress. You hear that j sound before an R, because going from a d to the consonant R, you pass by the j sound. So here this happens as well, because we have the E sound, plus we have a consonant R. It makes it sound like it's two syllables because it's going into E into that R. So you kind of have, it sounds oftentimes to kids like like it's two syllables, but it's just that carryover going into to an R. It's actually a subcategory of an R controlled vowel. Okay. But now when we have here and then we have heard, in Old English, it's quite common that you'll have words with EA that have the A sound, like break, B-R-E-A-K, that A sound. Also right? So if you had bread and then the E sound, like eat. And what happened is there was a vowel shift where the A sound is lower in your mouth. So you've got A and your jaw is lower, right? Then there's and E. So the sound went from being a low sound with your mouth open, A, to to E. So that's why for EA, we have different sounds for that spelling, because over time it's accent. That accents change. I mean, in England, there's still a ton of dialects depending on where you are in that teeny country. So, but for us, it helps us to know that those are the three sound changes and where they are in your mouth, so that we know that, okay, this could be ear, here, and then that heard is still going to be spelled E-A-R because it has the meaning of ear and here in it, right? And so I'm going to talk to you about dot and jotting. I sent you guys an attachment so that, hopefully you could do some of these with me. And I dot and jot them so that we can analyze, what is happening with the sounds and how these sounds should be broken down. And so we can translate them back into spelling, right? Sounds to spelling. So this is another way that you can sort words. So WH is a digraph, and it is two letters that make one sound. And if we need to help kids catch up on vocabulary or spelling or meaning, we can clump into multiple types of categories. And so I just showed how you could take WH and move it into 3 categories. If you teach the WH words that have to do with air and movement. So like if you're whisking something, you're going around a circle and you've got movement. And if you're whining, you can talk to your kids about whining. That's a lot of air. Whimpering or wheezing for breath. Those all have to do with air or movement. And there's more on that list. I just put a sampling on there. But that way you're kind of bringing in, the old Anglo-Saxon meaning of what WH represented and teaching them the meaning of words. Now, this is called a submorpheme. It's not like a whole morpheme, like a suffix or prefix, but it is a part of a word that contributes to the whole of the word. So, knowing that WH has something to do with, air or movement helps us to figure out some new vocabulary, and that is called a submorpheme. The interrogatives, so what, where, when, why, and which, you can teach those together. That way you're teaching the spelling, because people are always like, is it a W? Is it a WH? Well, this is going to help with a lot of that confusion. If you teach these kind of in a chunk separately, they're getting an opportunity to practice with these. And then also we have those WH words where, the W is silent. So, but it's only in words that have that O after it. So you could put those together. And then, if you taught, the one week and then the next week and the other week, and say, these are also interrogatives and they can be part of your lesson, depending on what, you're trying to teach. Okay. So when we go through, but this is all about being more efficient. So when we have struggling readers and learners, and we have, close to 1 million words in the dictionary, but we need to make sure they have, a good grasp. If we can give them bits and pieces of these to say, okay, we can put this, chunk these together, they're going to have an easier time holding on to them. And when you do, that's why I showed those pry lists in the beginning, where if you just go through the first 100, the second 100, the third 100, that's rote memorization. There's nothing anchoring these together. And you're not looking for whether I can sound them out or whether it's been taught or any of that. You're going to be using up a lot of working memory space for kids, and kids only have so much, space in their hard drive on their brain. So if we can organize things in a way that makes it easier for them, then I think it's easier for us as well. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Okay, so the word do. The word do seems to cause a lot of problems, right? Because it doesn't say it doesn't say oh, it says do. And so when you're going through and analyzing it, it's a good idea to spend time on all of the words that are in the same family. But if we can show kids that if you had do, even though it doesn't say do, like go, they still are actually very similar, because when we have does, we have do plus es makes does, right? So kids who are trying to just memorize the word does, they will spell it dose, right? Or all different ways. I've seen it, any number of ways. But when they understand that do is the base, then they just have to add the es. And if you put it next to a word like goes, that follows that same pattern, because remember there were vowel shifts in Old English, especially because they were, constantly conquering each other and being conquered, and new languages were coming in. And also the printing press came around and people were trying to standardize the language and the spellings. And, there's just a lot of history that goes into why these words kind of, seem irregular. But, a lot of it has to do with the kings and the fact that the Bible was not allowed to be printed in England because, Henry VIII wanted to, leave the church because he couldn't get a divorce and couldn't kill all his wives. I don't know if you know about Henry VIII, but it's kind of interesting story. You may want to pick a group of kids to tell it to, maybe not the youngest. But then you have done. Now we have do, does, and done, and we can see that do plus the ne which is an old English suffix, goes along with go and gone. So when these are next to each other, even though it's, this is the only pattern that follows this, we're at least possibly giving them something to anchor to that makes sense. And at a minimum, we're teaching them both at the same time. So I found that because they can see that, okay, do and go does the same thing, that they no longer spell does like dose, right? And then we do have to help them with that pronunciation. Okay, so I'm going to show you. No, I thought I brought do, but I didn't. I brought of, and I'll do of in a second. And laugh. Okay, so this is when we talk about the sound. This letter it's closed in a lot of Old English words because to avoid visual confusion before and or after the following letters. And this is often referred to as scribal O. But what happens is a lot of these words like rough, you can hear the O, that U sound. It was a U because UGH is saying the sound. So you can see on the left, when you had two U's next to one another, it's hard to read and you can't figure out if is that a W, is that a V, like what is happening there? So what they did is they closed off the U in a lot of words to, show that it's not part of the next letter, because it would look like a W, it would look like a V, it could look like several other letters. It's the same thing with the U followed by the V, because same reason, could look like a W. And so love, the reason we hear but it's spelled with an O, is because they needed it because of cursive, right? Now we do most everything in print when we're learning how to read. And so that is going to, doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But it did back when all we had were scribes and monks sitting in a monastery writing these books over and over and over again. It's the same thing for M. So you can see that from is harder to read without the U being connected at the top. And N and W are the same as well. So when we have sun, S-U-N, which is a different language of origin, versus son, S-O-N, which is Old English, if it was open, then it would look more like other letters, right? And the same thing with one, right? So with a lot of W words like wonder and one, that U is closed at the top. So you can sort through these words and you'll know for a lot of them, because you'll see it in like the word above, you're going to be closing that O. And the word month, M-O-N-T-H, was M-U, but because it's an M and an N, we closed off the U to make it so that it's easier to read. Same thing with Monday, because it used to be a U there as well. And so a lot of these, will help kids. You can put them all together, all the U's that are now O's. And that way the kids don't have to memorize everything. They can just work on the sounds that just have to memorize sounds that don't necessarily follow the rules. So I call words that have something irregular like this, I call them discovery words. And so I code them. So like this would be a part of the word that you still need to discover. We haven't figured out why it does that yet. So if I am doing dot and jot and I want to dot and jot the word from, first thing I do is I'm going to have to write it down and talk about it with my students. So I'd say, this is the word from, and can anybody use it in a sentence? And they would say, my mom is from New Jersey, and they can use it. They understand how to use it. Lots of, other kids can use it orally and make sure that they understand how the word is used. Then, because it's an irregular word, it's not totally phonetic. probably from the first spelling they've learned, which is then they have to see it in order to dot and jot it. And so this is just phoneme, grapheme mapping. And so you would say from, how many sounds do you hear in from? You hear that So there's 4 sounds in from. Then you go back and you put the letters in where they belong. And then we have that sounds like and So if I don't know about that scribal O, I put a little squiggly line under it and I say, well, that's that part of the word we have to discover later, right? Because maybe I don't know the reason, but now that I've just been taught the reason, I may not need that under there, or you can use it for just an unexpected sound. So it's unexpected. I know the reason, but it's still unexpected because it's not very common, right? Most of the time, if I hear then it's probably going to be a U or Schwab and not an O in a 1-syllable word, right? So definitely unexpected, right? If I had do, the word do, I also would want to write it out, talk to the kids, have them use them in sentences, make sure that they understand it. And then we say, how many sounds do you hear in do? Do, right? You put your first sound in, d, my second sound, do. And is that what we would expect? No. Okay, I know O says ah, or open syllable that it's do. So I'm going to make that my unexpected. Now, if I don't have it written, how on earth would I figure out how to write it? Right? Because I wouldn't know. If I said does, I would go d, z, right? And I don't know how I would spell it. I might spell it D-U-Z, or who knows. So it has to be written up here if it is a word that we know that they can't just do, super phonetically. And so you go D, and then O, E-S, okay? And you can say unexpected, and you say silent, because it's very common that an S says Z at the end of a word. But if the kids don't know that yet, then you might want to put a squiggle under that. So it's just all about, because if you're familiar with like heart words and people are talking about, the trying to get kids to orthographically map these words. And I see all these people asking, they're always asking questions like, what part is, do I put the waves under? And I'm like, it totally depends on what you've taught. If you have taught a concept and the kids understand it, then it's not unexpected because they already learned it. So this is the squiggly line or the silent or whatever is you're using that to show what you know, and then also what you have yet to discover. So these would be considered for me discovery words that my kids, when I first teach them in kindergarten, they would learn these words, but I may not have gone into scribal O, right? And what they needed to know about that. It just depends on the kids I'm working with. So I work with a lot of kids that have very low exposure, need a lot of extra work. Then it's probably not worth my lesson time to go into why the word of is spelled OF. I might just say, we need to learn that, and that's it. We've got no other option but practicing it. So we would say, can you use of in a sentence? And they would say, it's made of wood. And I would say, great, this is how you spell of. And usually the kids are like, oh, that's crazy, because it doesn't sound like that at all. But we can go and both of these would be considered unexpected if they did not know about the way it used to be spelled, right? So of, if you spelled it in cursive as UV, that is very hard to read. You don't know what that is, right? It looks like a W with an extra hump, right? So it was closed to make it an O. So we had the O, and then it's F and V are voiced and unvoiced pair. So, so they chose and that's how we got the spelling of. But I may not take the time to explain that to a kindergartner. if they are not familiar with all these other, kind of moving parts. Right. So we would dot and jot it. We, use it in a sentence, talk about it, spell it. We could do some, practice dictation, see if you remember it. And then I put my kids, when we do like center work, this is one of the activities that we do, is once we've learned it, this is the phonetic spelling, right, of. So this I put at centers because I actually came up with the idea because I was visiting a classroom and one of the girls was sitting at the back table and the word was. She was modeling the word was out of play. And I said to her, what word are you writing? And she said, this one. She just pointed to the popsicle stick. She had no idea what the word was, that it was the word was, why it was spelled that way, nothing. She was just copying it as if it was, an image. So what we do here is once we've introduced them, then I usually use my red clay, but I'm improvising because I'm having a professional development day and I shipped almost all of it out. I shipped all of it out for the class I'm having tomorrow on high frequency words. So these are high frequency words too. All right. And then we just create our little, and the steps would be see it, O-F, right? We're spelling it O-F, say it, of, and then shape it and mold it out. And then I have the kids have several of these on the table so they can practice it. And once they're done and they think they know it, I teach their friends how to quiz them. So their friend would get this and they would say, okay, spell the word of, because they can read it right there. And their friend has to say O-F. And if they got it right, they can move on to their next word, which might be was or could or should or whatever word that they're working on. So it gives them a chance to practice multiple ways, but in centers only work, we know, if they have something that is beneficial, not busy work, something that we know. And these words that are kind of, our discovery words, a little bit irregular, those are harder than other words for kids to internalize. Now, I put my discovery words after I teach them up on my discovery word wall. And so this is just a sample. And so for my curriculum, some of these, because I have my own curriculum, and so, people can teach in whatever order they want. But once I teach it, it would go up on the wall. So if I've taught do and does and done, then they would go up onto the wall. And these eventually, once I teach some of the rules, because B is very phonetic, right? It's an open syllable, it would come off because we've discovered what is going on with that word. So these are just your highly frequent words. And I practice them in all the ways I'm going to be showing you to help them, with reading and spelling. Now, as we move through.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
Just clarification. So you said when you teach the word, you add it to your discovery wall, but then did you say once they know the reason behind it, then you take it off?
For some of them, yeah, because we've discovered it. It's like a big, exciting time. So if I say, we start learning open syllables, but they needed, he and she to write sentences very early. And I might have taught them those so that they were spelling them correctly and practice them, on dot and jot and molding them and all that. Then I'd say, look, we've discovered, or usually they point it out. To be quite honest, I always forget to take them off the wall and the kids go, wait a second, isn't that an open syllable? And I'm like, you're right. So yes, they can come off. You can leave them on, but I tell the kids, oh, they've been discovered, like Eureka, yay. We figured it out. And then we can, take them off the wall. Because sometimes, and it depends on the teacher. Some teachers don't know the reasons, but at least the, most common, seemingly irregular words are there for the kids to be able to look at and find when they want to spell them. And they know that those are the ones that have something about them that is unusual. So like here, when you look at this, what you'll find with most of these words is it's not the whole word. This is the whole word, but most of the time it's just the vowel. The vowel is tricky, especially in Old English. And this way it takes the burden off of kids. They don't have to memorize the whole word. They just can memorize part of it. They know that, oh, that vowel, I remember that was the one that was weird. So it just kind of limits, some of the cognitive burden for some of these kids. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so back to presentation. Okay, so another one is UGH. So UGH really only does two things. It says the sound or it says nothing. So when we're teaching UGH, when we say, all these words with OUGH and AUGH are crazy, we can, and these are just, I picked some that are, frequent, but when you start to understand what's going on, then it's really not as hard as you think. So when you look at that O saying, like in enough and rough and tough, here the UGH is saying the sound. And so the O is really just the scribal O that we just talked about. So when you're doing this, you want to think about, what have I taught so far that they need to know? But at a minimum, you're saying, okay, the only weird thing in the word tough is that O. But if you know scribal O, then it's not a problem anymore, right? For cough, once you know that UGH says the sound, it's totally phonetic because it's basically just ah, that's it. Laugh, same thing. UGH says laugh, totally phonetic. So when I teach laugh, I would go to my dot and jot and map the word laugh. I would tell them about UGH and then we would practice some words. But I said, okay, laugh. Okay, so that's the word laugh. We learned that UGH says the sound. So let's dot and jot it. Ooh, ah. And that's how we'd map it. And that's honestly pretty easy. So, but once they learn that, then they don't have to memorize. I mean, I've seen people say, I'm like, why would you do that? When the is normal, the is normal, and the UGH is just, if you want to, unexpected, right? But since we know that UGH says the F sound or nothing, it's going to make our life a lot easier. So then I also do the quicksand that I was just doing, but then this is what I do for discovery words, is I put a grid underneath my letters, and I'm left-handed, so it would be on a 45-degree angle this way. If you're right-handed, it's this way. And then I have the kids go L-A-U-G-H spells laugh, because we need to get this imprinted into our orthographic memory. We need to remember this word because it is highly frequent and a little bit irregular, right? So then we would go L-A-U-G-H spells laugh. Trace it with your finger to feel, because the crayon will leave residue. And as the kids do this, they go L-A-U-G-H spells laugh. Then they switch to their pencil and write it without the grid 3 times. L-A-U-G-H spells laugh. Then they would fold it over, and we tell them to try to remember what they learned. They can flip it back if they need to, but hopefully they won't need to. We can just flip it over and they'll remember it. but I call it self-checking. If they want to flip back and look at it, they can. But we want to try to take it out of their visual memory. My ink over here. Then I have them write it here. And check, make sure it's right. Then they get to fingerprint in between to help space and write it again. And so this fingerprinting just like wipes off your finger. This is the one that I use, but you can do this just on a blank sheet of paper with a grid under it to give that kind of tactile reinforcement. But now they can spell a lot of words that have UGH, and then we're going to teach them about when UGH says nothing. Okay, so if UGH says nothing, and I have the word bought, and I say sometimes UGH doesn't tell me anything except for that it was Old English, all right? And so, but when I listen for the number of sounds, I would go b, ah, t. So what goes in the first sound, that looks pretty easy to figure out. Then the ah, pretty easy. UGH, I put them all in one box, which goes like this, the UGH silent. And then that word becomes totally phonetic. We know that that UGH is silent. So now it's just b, ah, t. So if we had fought, it would be the same thing. I could even say to a student, oh, it's spelled just like bought, right? If I want to say brought, it's like bought, but you have to add that r sound in there. So then they're starting to understand, you know, ought, bought, brought, fraught, which is AU, sorry. And now you're clumping these together, because one of the biggest, you know, memes out there is that English is crazy because of these words. And if you can take these words and clump them into chunks and explain to them what's happening, then it's a lot easier for kids to digest this information. So with caught and taught and daughter, you know, that UGH is silent, but that A is saying ah. And so that is irregular. But now you don't have to memorize everything in the middle. You just have to memorize that that A is not really saying ah, it's doing something unexpected. And when we look at though, if the UGH is silent, then that's really just like an open syllable, though, right? And do. But you just need to remember that there's that silent UGH at the end. Okay. This is another activity that I do for kids to help them, because the noun and verb for single syllable words, so many single syllable words have multiple meanings. And a lot of times we just talk to kids about one meaning at a time. So I'll do dictation across the bottom, and then I'll have them, you know, in small groups, talk about the multiple meanings. So my kids who struggle with language, it's great for them to be in a small group with kids who have language, because then they're learning it from, you know, other people. So they may know what a fish is, but they don't think about, oh, I fish for fish, right? That it's a verb, and, you know, and a noun. Same thing with book. I can book a hotel room, that's a verb, and I can read a book, and that's a noun. And then they get more exposure to these multiple meaning words. Monosyllabic words, single syllable words have, I mean, the word book has like 40 meanings. The word set, S-E-T, has 400 meanings. So they tend to have 40 or more meanings because they are Anglo-Saxon, Old English, you know, those Viking Norse words. And they were very economical in the number of words that they had. They just had lots of meanings for them. So that is a really good activity. Another good one for kids that are confusing spelling, and this helps with vocabulary, is, you know, we've got all these homophones that get confusing, but if we can, you know, have them analyzed and look at it and say, okay, well, what is going on with these words? We have pause is plural, P-A-W-S. So that S means it's plural. If it's P-A-U-S-E, then it's not plural. So what are you trying to say? Are you saying my cat's paws? Then which one would you pick? Because you're talking about more than one paw. And this helps kids to see the difference between these words that are commonly confused. And you're also teaching that E in this case, it's a plural canceller. It is there so we don't think that it is more than one of what we're talking about. Because if we have plea, like a plea for help, and we said, did you hear his pleas? That meant more than one plea for help versus the word please with the E at the end. And so this helps with, understanding what words mean, looking at it from a grammar perspective and plural or singular, but it's also teaching rules, right? So those embedded rules that are in these words. Past tense, when you have like allowed and allowed, I mean, that's past tense, ED. When you take all these together and say, well, let's talk about these together. And I took the word build and build and put them on to the side in a matrix. And if you have the word build, like to make a house, these are the words that you could make, like rebuild, builder, buildings. But if you have build, like to present a statement of fees, all right? So I was billed for his services. These are billable hours. I was over billing my client. I guess it's probably not a young kid word, but definitely an older kid word. Then they can start to see that the base meaning is what, if you want to write a sentence, then what do you want to say? Do you want to say I want to build a house, or do you want to say I want to, I was billed too much? And then this helps them to see the difference between these commonly confused spellings. Because a lot of it is really about that comparison. Instead of doing it in isolation, people say, well, don't do it together, it's too confusing. I'm like, I think it's the exact opposite. I think kids can look at these and say, now I see the difference, because they've got the visual comparison, and you're also doing morphology because ED is past tense, and you can talk about this pattern. Okay, consonant blends. I wanted to talk about consonant blends because they have meaning. I'm going to send you some of the meanings, but the difference between a blend and a digraph, a lot of kids get confused, but a blend has two or more sounds, right? And a digraph can have two or more letters. It can be a digraph or a trigraph. But in a blend, they retain their own sound. And that's what makes that so important. Some things like WR is not a blend, and MB is not an ending blend. NG is a digraph. So I'm going to send you guys all these slides so you have them. But it's just, these are just some of the common confusions. Since I don't know exactly who's on this call and what your experience is, I figured this would be good to have. And this is some of the morphology. So if you teach kids in these kind of areas, it helps them to be able to see. Someone asked me a question. Okay, what is the best practice for teaching digraphs and blends in terms of which should be taught first? I teach my digraphs first because they are a sound. There's 44 sounds in our language, and sh is a sound, sh is a sound. When you get to blends, you should have taught all the sounds, because if you have blend, b, bull, if you already taught those, that should be pretty easy. And the ending blend, n, d, those all should have been taken care of. So when you teach blends, you're really just reviewing what you've already taught. I definitely teach digraphs first. I know there are a lot of people who think kids can't handle it, but I teach all the digraphs, not all of them, but a lot of them, majority in kindergarten, because the kids use them. They know how to say ship, they know how to say chip, they can understand it. So they're cool with it. And so these are like teaching bases, free, they can stand by themselves, bound, they have to be around other affixes. And then the different types of connectors. And so I have an example so you can see that, how we can sort some of these words by morphology. So when we look at one, the ON means one. It means one and only. It means it in once. It means it in alone. There's a really good video that kids like. I like it. That explains it. You could teach it by submorpheme. So TW means two. And if it means two, you could teach two and twin and 12 and twist and 20 and all of those. Or you can start doing a little bit more advanced phonics rules, like words in English don't end in the letter V. And then you could teach have and live and leave. But this is also words like active, right? And then you're sorting these words so that you're giving them, less burden on their memory, right? Even little kids, I teach them about big words like helicopter and pterodactyl, because they know these words. They use these words. They're probably more knowledgeable in these kind of things than I am. And, but I'm not going to ask them to spell these. I'm just going to talk to them about what they mean. And when I talk about helicopter, helicopter is spiral flyer, PTER, and pterodactyl is flying finger. So the PTER in helicopter has the same exact meaning as the PTER in pterodactyl. And kids can see that. So now we're opening their eyes. We're not asking them to spell it. We're not asking them to know, Greek, or know that that O is a connective, but they're starting to see that it's not, because I've had a situation where kids like, I thought it was a cop from hell. And I was like, no, it has nothing to do with the meaning at all. So, but they can start to see that these patterns, so it's never too early to start talking about it. But when you're starting to really get into, the spelling of Greek, it might be, a little later on till they're a little bit more adept. This is a matrix. So when you're doing these types of things, instead of teaching one word at a time or 20 different words that aren't related, you can do a matrix like this, and then you have respect, respectful, perspective, prospector, retrospective, right? Inspection, all of these words that they're learning at once, plus the meaning of the prefixes and the meaning of the suffixes, and they're understanding, where the word spect came from. And then usually, because this is just from my wordplay curriculum, but it's not all inclusive. They might know spectacular, which I don't have on here, or spectator. So this is like my introduction to spect. So it's not all inclusive, but it's definitely giving them, an understanding of the word parts. Right. So language of origin, I think, is a great thing to teach kids. So, when we talk about Anglo-Saxon, they tend to be, a conglomeration of German and Dutch and Viking and Norse, and they're mostly monosyllabic words. It's really good for the lower grades. And these are, TW is two, SL is slippery or slide, SN means nose, GL means glow. It's just like that WH you can teach in a cluster to help them understand meaning. Latin, multisyllabic words, it's also 60% of our language, so it's pretty important that we teach it. And Greek, some of the common blends would be better taught if they were taught with the actual meaning, so that we know that cron is time and chrome is color and hydra is water. And then this is just some of my contact information if anybody has any questions. So I think my hour's up. Does anybody have questions? I'm happy to stick around and answer anything you have.
Well, I want to say thank you. I found this very fascinating and a wonderful approach to teaching the words. And thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay. No questions?
Feel free to unmute if you have a question or a comment.
I'm happy to answer.
Well, thank you very much. It was very informative.
Oh, good. And I'll send you guys all the slides and the dot and jot, and so you can ask me questions via email if you have any. Okay. And Lisa, it was good to catch up with you.
Thank you again for taking the time to visit with us. It was very informative.
Yes,
No problem.
thank you, Jennifer.
All right,
I always
you guys have a
learn
great
so
evening.
much.
Bye.
And people are saying they can't wait for the slides.
Okay, good.
That was great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And perfect timing.
Cammie, thank you for bringing Jennifer to our
Oh.
state. She's amazing. I've attended lots of her trainings in many